Hey class. In this lesson we're going to look a little bit more at Kant's theory of freedom and of the good will. There are a lot of really great resources on the web already to go through the idea of the categorical imperative and Kant's moral philosophy in general. Make sure that you have watched those videos before this, because I'm going to assume that you have an understanding of the categorical imperative and of why Kant thinks lying is bad and these things that were covered in those prior videos. And I'm going to go more into the idea of the idea of freedom and of the goodwill here. So he says that the only thing that is good in itself is a good will. And what he's getting at here is the difference between things that are good for something else and things that are good in and of themselves. So the goodwill cannot be something merely transitive, but must be intransitive. So transitive means a means to an end. You do this for the sake of that. Intransitive means that it's not for the sake of anything else. We desire something because it's good for something. I want to learn how to play piano. What is good for that is practicing. I want to not be hungry anymore. I must eat food in order to do that. So these would all be transitive goods. Intransitive is something that is for its own sake. I will the good for its own sake. Closely related to this is the problem of the a priori versus a posteriori. So derived from experience versus prior to experience. And what Kant wants to say is that the goodwill has to be intransitive and a priori. It cannot be related to things that we discover in experience, and it cannot be working towards something. It cannot be development in a stage towards something else. And lying for Kant is such a exemplary central idea for this, because he thinks that the way in which we will a rational good implies the impossibility of lying a posteriori, prior to any situation or any conditions that we gain through experience. Why? Because in lying we are communicating with someone else, and someone else has to be a rational being that has a will of their own. And so lying will always be using that person as a means to an end. And therefore, a priori, prior to any conditions, we know that that is bad, and that the only thing that you can will rationally and without any contradiction, and in terms of an intransitive principle of goodness, is to treat other people as ends and not as means. To not treat them as a tool, but as something which has their own dignity within them. So closely related to this is his idea of a hypothetical versus a categorical imperative. And I'm not going to go into this in detail. You can read this slide, and this is covered in the previous videos. But basically, hypothetical is always dependent on some possible situation. If I want to be happy, I have to do X, Y, and Z in order to become happy. So there's a hypothetical there, an if-then. Categorical says that there's no conditions which could possibly change the situation. So happiness is always a hypothetical imperative. It is an end for humans in terms of organizing our life, in terms of pleasure and pain and good fortune and things like that. But it's something that is dependent on those conditions, and it is necessary that we organize things in a certain way, but it is purely hypothetical, not categorical, in the sense that it does depend on certain conditions. So, like I said, that is all covered in the previous videos, and please look to those in order to gain a better insight into that. What I want to get into here is his idea of freedom. So what is freedom given these ideas? Freedom is a principle. That means that it is a source. It is something that produces something. It is something that creates and generates reality in a certain way. He says will is a kind of causality that living beings exert if they are rational. And when the will can be effective independent of outside causes acting on it, that would involve the causality's property of freedom. So freedom here is a kind of separateness, independence from outside conditions, right? Happiness depends on outside conditions. In order to become happy, I need to do X, Y, and Z. I need to transitively bring about certain conditions. I need to use certain things instrumentally, right, as tools to bring about those conditions. Freedom is going to be completely separate from that. It's going to be independent from those. And it is a kind of independence from outside causes. But he says that this account of freedom is purely negative. It's something lacking. We lack dependency on the world. We negate the dependency. It's an external definition, and it's in relation to external things. It says that freedom is the active will does not have any external causes acting on it. So it does not have any external causes. It's a negation of external causes acting on the will. This is a purely negative definition of will. This is similar to Spinoza. Freedom thought in terms of external relation. Your freedom or servitude is in relation to something else acting on you. So he wants to say we need a better definition of freedom, one that is positive. He says this isn't a fruitful insight into what freedom is. Fruitful or creative or fecund, productive, generative idea of freedom. He says, but there flows from it a conception of freedom that is positive and accordingly richer and more fruitful, more generative idea of freedom. He says, although freedom is not a property of the will according to the laws of nature, it doesn't follow that freedom is lawless. So freedom isn't just some lawlessness or some separate from externality. It's not just some absolutely detached thing that does whatever it wants without any relation to anything else. Freedom is not happiness, and happiness depends on relationships to nature and to certain conditions. So then would freedom just be some lawlessness, some complete separation from conditions? No, Kant wants to say. He says, it must in fact be a causality according to immutable laws of a special kind. The concept of lawlessness, free will, would be an absurdity. So it's not a concept, and this gets to what we said in the previous lesson. It's not some way of grasping our substance of our soul or our will in terms of concepts. Because the concept of causality brings with it the concept of laws according to which something to be called a cause is given, then something else, the effect, must occur. So in our sensible intuitions, cause and effect are combinations of cause and an effect, and these are separate entities. But that's not the way it is in our internal freedom, the kind of causality and law that is present within our internal states. He says that if something we call a cause is given, then something else, the effect, must occur. And since freedom conceptually involves causality, and causality conceptually involves law, it follows that freedom conceptually involves law. So we have a kind of syllogism here. But the kind of causality and the kind of law that is involved in freedom is not the same as the kind of law involved in nature and the kind of causality involved in phenomenon of nature. But that doesn't mean that freedom is not a kind of law. What kind of law is it? Well, it's a autonomous law, not a heteronymous law. So he said, we saw that natural necessity is heteronomy of effective causes, because each effect can come about only through a law in accordance with something else. So hetero means other. One thing comes about because of its relationship to something else. And Kant, he is a reader of Newton and very strong supporter of Newtonian science. And in Newtonian science, every reality in the world is intimately bound up with every other one through gravity and through determinate laws. Gravity is a law. But those are heteronymous. Each thing is determined causally by its reciprocal relationship on every other thing in the world through gravitational relationships. Let's just take that one alone. Everything is determined by something else, and it exercises a causal relationship on it heteronymously. So he wants to say that freedom is utterly different than this. It is not determined through a reciprocal relationship. He says, what can freedom be, freedom of the will be, but the autonomy of the will's property of itself being a law? So it's not determined through a reciprocal relation of itself on something else, but through an autonomous relationship of itself on itself. The will itself is a law in all its actions and expresses the principle. Act only on a maxim that can also have itself as a universal law of its object. So the will imposes on itself a certain law. It wills that it be able to legislate with respect to itself, that all of its maxims, all of the things that it holds as principles on which to act, can be universalized, so that the will acts rationally and universally. So lying is a perfect example here. The will acts, it tells something, it communicates, and it communicates to someone else. But what does it do in that act? It has to uphold a universal law. When someone communicates, they must communicate truthfully. Why? Well, if I'm going to communicate, it means I'm going to communicate something that the other person assumes to be truth. And if I break that pact, if I choose to lie, I undermine the very principle on which I act. And I cannot universalize this. If I say that everyone should lie, I destroy the very possibility of communicating in general. The only way that I can withhold rationally that communication is something that I should do, I should communicate, well, then I cannot say that I should lie, because then I undermine the very foundation on which I act, and I impose a certain contradiction in my action. So the will must universalize its maxim. It must universalize its will. It must universalize its very will. The will must universalize its will. That means it acts autonomously. It imposes a law on itself which governs its activity. He says, therefore, a free will and a will under moral law are identical. What does that mean? The will in acting, in legislating, in giving itself a law, in laying down a law, is exactly the same as a will that is subject to the law, that is under the moral law, that accepts that law. So there's no difference with being subject to the law and being the legislator of the law. There would be a difference if there was heteronomy, if there was an external reason. If I was taking this law from someone else, the commandments, thou shalt not kill, that's heteronomy. I'm being determined by someone else. But when I'm being determined by myself, when I know that the meaning of the law is the universal law and I give it to myself, I am both subject and legislator. And that's autonomy. So freedom is thus a universal principle that belongs to all rational beings. It's not something that is applied to us, that we take from outside, but it is the very internal source of freedom itself. And every will must presuppose this freedom. It says, it isn't enough to ascribe freedom to our will on whatever grounds if we don't also have sufficient grounds for attributing it to all rational beings. For morality serves as a law for us only because we are rational beings. So it must hold for all rational beings, and morality must be derived solely from the property of freedom. So freedom must be shown to be a property of the will of all rational beings. So freedom comes about through rationally willing what is determinable by the laws of heteronomy itself. Freedom is not some arbitrary thing that can just do whatever it wants. No, it does what is rationally within the confines of a free will. And so reason and freedom are completely intertwined for Kant. It's impossible that someone who is rational and exercising their will is going to come to anything except for the categorical imperative, is going to come to any idea other than that lying is bad. It's impossible for rational beings to come to that idea, any other idea than that, if they're using their reason. Reason must regard itself as the author of its principles, owing nothing to external circumstances. So it must, as practical reason or as the will of rational beings, regard itself as free. Kant calls this the practical postulate. It must assume its own freedom in order to act. So when it legislates to itself its own possible freedom, gives itself the law on which it acts freely, it cannot regard itself as externally being driven to this. It must only regard itself as the author of this freedom. That is to say that the will of a rational being can be his will only under the idea of freedom, and so that the practical point of view, such a will must be ascribed to all rational beings. So, in order to think about freedom, we must think about the rational being. He says, we saw only that we must presuppose, if we want to think of a being as rational and as conscious of itself as the cause of its own actions, that is, as endowed with a will. So we find that on just those same grounds, we must ascribe to each being endowed with reason, the will, this property of setting for itself how it will act, and doing this under the idea of freedom. So it's impossible to conceive of rational beings except as beings that, by their own will, give themselves their own moral law. And that is what the idea of freedom is. And so in our own idea of freedom, we necessarily grasp the idea of a rational being in general. And Kant will go on to say that this implies that there is a community of rational beings. And we grasp immediately in this idea of freedom that there are other free beings. And what do we grasp of those free beings? That they have dignity and that they are good in themselves, that they cannot be used as a means to an end, that they have in their own freedom a kind of law that says we should not treat them as anything other than an end in themselves, as something dignified and not reducible to a tool for our own pleasure or happiness. And one last idea that is central to Kant's conception of freedom is that freedom is an ability to detach ourselves from empirical interests, from the desire for happiness and for pleasure. So when we feel that someone else has dignity, is a morally dignified being that should not be treated as an object, we feel in ourselves that we ought to detach ourselves from our empirical interests. Our empirical interests might say, take advantage of that person, use that person as a tool, submit them to our desire, and negate the fact that they have a freedom of their own. What arises in moral sentiment, in our feeling of being free and self-legislating, is that we are capable of detaching ourselves from these things that would cause us to treat other people as a means and not as an ends in themselves. So this desire, he says, compensates for the loss of everything that could make our situation desirable. What that means is that we feel always a greater call towards morality than we'll ever feel towards the desires for things in the practical world. That is what moral sentiment is. It's this unshakable feeling that there's a greater interest in preserving the dignity of other people than there is in taking advantage of them.